First puzzle, the threats are queen takes knight, bishop takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check. The checks are bishop takes pawn, check. Knight to f3, check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop, a4, bishop to d5, c6. Another puzzle, threats in puzzle position are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is e3, rook to f1, rook to g4, king to h5, rook takes pawn. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to b7, check. Queen to b8, check. Bishop to a6, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to b8, check. King to d7. Bishop to b5, check. c6. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. King to d6. Rook to b6. Another one, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. g4, check. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. King to c3. King to e6. King to b4. Another one, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes bishop. f3, check. King to b1. g6. Rook to e7. f2. Queen to f1. One more, threats in this position are rook takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen takes rook, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Rook to c1. g5. Rook takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. Next, threats in puzzle position are pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes bishop, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to e7, check. Queen to e8, check. Rook takes bishop, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to f7. Queen to g6. Rook to d7, check. King to c8. Queen to f3. Knight to c2, check. King to a2. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. King takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king takes pawn. h4. g6. King to d3. King to f4. King to d4. King to g4. One more, threats in this position are rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook to e8, check. Rook to c7, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to c1. King to d8. Rook to a7. Let's continue. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Here are the checks. Queen to d4, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to f3. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Rook takes rook. Another one, here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g7, check. Queen to h8, check. The best move in puzzle position is knight to h4. Queen to g4. Bishop to h6. c5. h3. Queen to d4. Queen to g3, check. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to g5, check. The puzzle is solved using knight takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Queen to g5, check. King to h1. Knight takes queen. Let's continue. The threats are knight takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes bishop. Here are the checks. Pawn takes pawn, check. Bishop to e8, check. Queen to d5, check. Queen takes knight, check. The best move in puzzle position is pawn takes pawn, check. King to c8. Queen to f7. Bishop to d5, check. Queen takes rook. Queen to g5, check. Queen takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. f4. King to c2. Bishop to e7. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are king takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using h4. King to e3. King takes pawn. g3. h3. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Knight to c6. Knight takes bishop, check. Queen takes knight. Rook to e8. Knight takes queen. Next, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Here are the checks. f4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. f4, check. King to e6. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. h4. King to e6. b4. King to d5. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to e4. b4. f5. d3. King takes pawn. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is knight to d5. Queen to d8. Queen to h6. Queen takes pawn. Knight to f6, check. Queen takes knight. Rook takes queen. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to e8. g6. Queen to g5. Queen to c5. Queen to d8. Queen to f8. Queen takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook to c8, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen. One more. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is queen to h5. Rook to f8. Knight to g4. Bishop to g7. Bishop to e5. c5. f3. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to e2, check. Queen to c5, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Queen to a4. Rook to e2. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Knight to g4. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes pawn. Pawn takes rook. Rook to e1, check. King to f8. Knight to e6, check. King to g8. Knight takes queen. Another one. The threats are rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. King takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are rook takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. King takes knight. d6, check. King to g6. d7. Bishop takes pawn. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.